A reading from the book of Joshua. Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spake unto Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan. 40,000 prepared for war went before the Lord unto battle, into ye plain of Jericho. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. They burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. The book of Joshua is required reading in Israeli schools today. The book holds an important place because in its pages many people think that a precedent can be found for the establishment of Israel as a nation. The book of Joshua provided the muscular and militaristic dimension of conquest and the annihilation of the Canaanites and other ancient peoples that populated the Promised Land. Hi, my name is GDF, and you can probably tell by the direction that this video is going in that I'm not very advertiser-friendly. For that reason, I rely completely on my patrons, subscribers, and donations. Following the creation of the State of Israel, biblical archaeology became an obsession. Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, was, as were almost all of the earliest contemporary Zionists, an atheist. Although many early Jewish Zionists were secular, socialists, and atheists, the biblical narrative was an appealing way of legitimizing the Zionist movement. Upon assuming his role as first premier, cementing his legacy as Israel's founding father, Ben-Gurion organized Bible study classes in his official residence and was instrumental in making the study of the Book of Joshua a major component of the school curriculum in Israel. It was this atheist socialist Ben-Gurion who declared to the Peel Commission in 1936 that the Bible is our mandate, and was later quoted as declaring, "Though I reject theology, the single most important book in my life is the Bible." Using a nationalist interpretation, the Bible came to become a course material taught as immutable fact to school children. The Bible came to serve as the first history book to be studied by all school children within the Zionist community in Palestine, as well as under the auspices of the Israeli education system within the modern state of Israel, as well as being taken for granted by the scientific community and academia generally. From a collection of theological texts incorporating historical plots and divine miracles aimed at inculcating faith in its readers, it became a compilation of historiographic texts that bore only a smattering of optional religious meaning. So ingrained was the Bible in schooling by 1992 that Benjamin Beit Halachmi, professor of psychology at the University of Haifa, could write, "Most Israelis today, as a result of Israeli education, regard the Bible as a source of reliable historic information of a secular, political kind." And it remained that way even into the 21st century, to the point that under no circumstances is it permissible to skip over the book of Joshua. Moreover, even though the teaching of this past has been proven ethically and pedagogically destructive, the Israeli education system refuses to exclude from the curriculum these shameful accounts of extermination. After all, David Ben-Gurion had repeatedly invoked the book of Joshua to justify the massacres and ensuing ethnic cleansing carried out under the guise of the 1948 war. But even before 1948, the excavation of Palestine was underway during the Mandatory period starting in 1917. Indeed, under British control, the first archaeological crusader seeking to dig up the Holy Land as told by the Bible was none other than the American William Foxwell Albright. His legacy as one of the most influential biblical scholars of the 20th century makes his worldview all the more disturbing. As a fundamentalist, Albright did not doubt stories like the Book of Joshua, and even justified them. In those days, warfare was total, and we Americans have perhaps less right than most modern nations to sit in judgment on the Israelites of the 13th century BC, since we have, intentionally or otherwise, exterminated scores of thousands of Indians in every corner of our great nation and have crowded the rest into great concentration camps. It often seems necessary that a people of markedly inferior type should vanish before a people of superior potentialities, since there is a point beyond which racial mixture cannot go without disaster. Thus the Canaanites, with their orgiastic nature worship, their cult of fertility in the form of serpent symbols and sensuous nudity, and their gross mythology, were replaced by Israel, with its pastoral simplicity and purity of life, its lofty monotheism, and its severe code of ethics. In the words of revisionist biblical scholar Keith Whitelam of the University of Stirling, this justification by one of the great icons of 20th century biblical scholarship of the slaughter of the indigenous Palestinian population is remarkable for two reasons. It is an outpouring of undisguised racism which is staggering, but equally startling is the fact that this statement is never referred to or commented on, as far as I know, by biblical scholars in their assessments of the work of Albright. There's just one glaring problem with Foxwell's analysis, and further the foundational texts justifying the Zionist project and the creation of the State of Israel. It's all bullshit. The slaughter as told in the book of Joshua never happened, and the stories of the Israelites in the Bible are not even remotely historically accurate. It was 1999 when Zeev Herzog, professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, who at one time was the director of their Institute of Archaeology, wrote a piece for the weekly Haaretz magazine titled Deconstructing the Walls of Jericho. His words were difficult ones for biblical literalists. Following 70 years of intensive excavations in the land of Israel, archaeologists have found out the Israelites did not sojourn in Egypt, did not wander in the wilderness, did not conquer the land of Canaan in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. Additionally, as opposed to the long-held claim of a sovereign united kingdom of Israel, the united monarchy of David and Solomon, which was described in the Bible as a regional superpower, was, at most, a small tribal kingdom. Herzog describes the ascent of William Foxwell Albright in the 1920s, and later, following the establishment of the State of Israel, the founding fathers of Israeli archaeology, including Benjamin Mazar, Naaman Avigad, Yigal Yadin, and others. Herzog writes that using the Bible as a literal guide to exploring the Bronze and Iron Ages was standard practice from the beginning, which would continue for decades. However, writes Herzog, little by little cracks began to appear in the picture. To take one example, the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, wandering for 40 years across the Sinai. Many Egyptian documents known to us do not mention at all the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt or the later exodus of an entire people, which was curious considering the Egyptians kept highly detailed records which included even small incursions. Many documents mention the practice of wandering shepherds to enter Egyptian territory in times of drought or famine and to settle at the fringes of the Nile Delta. Or how about Mount Sinai, where Moses was to receive the Ten Commandments? Generations of researchers have tried to locate the site of Mount Sinai and the encampments of the Israelite tribes in the wilderness. Despite the strenuous efforts, not even one site has been located that would accord with the biblical account. And of course, the historicity of the conquest, or rather genocide of the Canaanites, was especially problematic. Here, the most severe difficulties have arisen. The book of Joshua reveals that as the armed men approach Jericho, the city's walls miraculously collapse, ushering in the slaughter. But Kathleen Kenyon, the excavator of Jericho, established definitively that there is no support for the conjecture that Jericho was fortified with a city wall during the Late Bronze Age. In reality, excavations at all the sites uncovered only unfortified settlements, while in many instances, the site held only isolated structures of the ruler's palace and no actual city. Urban culture in Late Bronze Age Palestine was disintegrating in a process that lasted hundreds of years and was not the result of a military conquest. Herzog isn't revealing that big of a secret, he writes. These facts have been known for years, but Israel is a stubborn people and nobody wants to hear about it. These issues and more were addressed by a colleague of Herzog at Tel Aviv University, Emeritus Professor of History Shlomo Sand. In the 13th century BCE, the purported time of the Exodus, Canaan was ruled by the still powerful pharaohs. This means that Moses led the freed slaves out of Egypt to Egypt? Sand also took issue with the numbers. According to the biblical narrative, the people he led through the wilderness for 40 years included 600,000 warriors. They would have been traveling with their wives and children, implying a party of around 3 million in total. Aside from the fact that it was utterly impossible for a population of such size to wander through the desert for so long, an event of such magnitude should have left some epigraphic or archaeological traces. The ancient Egyptians kept meticulous records of every event, and there is a great deal of documentation about the kingdom's political and military life. There are even documents about incursions of nomadic groups into the realm. Yet there is not a single mention of any children of Israel who lived in Egypt or rebelled against it or emigrated from it at any time. There's also another, more uncomfortable fact. History can be ironic. Few people have noticed, or are willing to acknowledge, that the land of Israel of biblical texts did not include Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, or their surrounding areas, but rather only Samaria and a number of adjacent areas. In other words, the land of the northern kingdom of Israel. Because a united kingdom encompassing both ancient Judea and Israel never existed, a unifying Hebrew name for such a territory never emerged. As a result, all biblical texts employed the same pharaonic name for the region, the land of Canaan. Israel, without Jerusalem. Indeed, the second book of Chronicles reveals, with Israel once more intact, he returned to Jerusalem. Though claims to the city have been the source of so much strife and suffering, Jerusalem's significance historically, especially among the Zionist movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is tentative. As explained in a helpful article for the New York Review of Books by Avishai Margalit, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Hebrew University. Margalit points out that the founding of Jerusalem predates Islam, Christianity, and in fact, Judaism itself. It is thought that Jerusalem was founded about 4,000 years ago as a city of ritual worship by the Canaanites. Jumping ahead thousands of years, Zionism had ambitions to create a new Jewish society, but Jerusalem was the least appropriate place for the founding of such a new society. Most of the Jerusalem Jews were part of an ultra-Orthodox community of the sort that the Zionists were rebelling against, a community that lived on donations and did not have the kind of productive life that the Zionist revolution aspired to. It is no wonder, then, that the Zionists preferred to build the new Hebrew city in the golden sands of Tel Aviv. Most of the immigrants to Israel, about 80%, settled along the Mediterranean coast, a region that had never been the historic homeland of the Jewish people. It appears this ambivalence is a historic trend. Unlike Christianity, Judaism does not regard the pilgrimage to Jerusalem as an act of penance for transgressions, or an act that can purify the believer, and we therefore find no recommendation that it be implemented. The data appear to illustrate this point further. We know of approximately 30 texts that provide accounts of Jewish pilgrimage during the 1700 years between 135 CE and the mid-19th century. By contrast, for the 1500 years between 333 CE and 1878, we have some 3,500 reports of Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land. These words are at stark odds with the Israeli Proclamation of Independence issued at Tel Aviv on May 14, 1948. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people remained faithful to it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return. Exiled from their land is, of course, a reference to the story of the Roman Empire exiling Jews from their province of Judea. This foundational myth is the source of the theory that the Jewish diaspora